And I encourage people really to put themselves in the position of this time frame, meaning, think of you being a disciple and think of even John writing this and think of Thomas's perspective, kind of get inside there. And one thing to point out right off the bat is that John includes details that perhaps would be considered sort of embarrassing to the disciples, their cause, and even to particular disciples, not just Thomas, but to others as well in various places. And that lends the reality to it, the credibility to it, that they're struggling with this as well. John's not trying to prop them up. Yeah, he's not sort of saying, because let's say this was written in the 80s, the 90s or so. He's not sort of like trying to make the church leaders or himself or whoever's left, we don't know who is dead at this time or whatever, kind of look all good or like these perfect models. They're not believing as well. The women come and tell all of them. Thomas just wasn't there the first time around for whatever reason, and he's just believing later. So he gets the appellation Doubting Thomas, but ultimately he's believing Thomas, and then he's going Thomas. He, according to the traditions we have, most likely went to India, and that seems to be corroborated by some details that are mentioned in his account, like who the king was of the region he went to, the local Indian church in that area seemed to be martyred there as well. So, this is the legacy of faithfulness ultimately. And John's not really in the other Gospels prominently that well. He makes some cameos, mainly in John. John 11, let's go, on into Jerusalem. And they're like, well, we know what's going to happen there. And Thomas speaks up and says, let us go also that we may die with him. So maybe melancholy or dour, kind of like, well, that's the worst that could happen. But faithful, let's go too. You see that right there.
Yeah, we'll probably get into this, but I do think he gets a little bit of a bad rap being called Doubting Thomas. I think there's reasons for that that we'll begin to discuss. There was doubt there certainly, but again, you put yourself in his position. The idea of someone rising from the dead is so spectacular, and especially knowing that Jesus was crucified in the way. Crucifixion is almost the destruction of a person, right? There's no Romans know how to kill people dead, right? So the idea that someone like Jesus could actually rise from the dead was just so out of the ordinary. The disciples are hiding out at this point, even after knowing that the tomb is empty. At this point, they just think, the most natural reaction isn't Jesus rose from the dead, it's someone stole the body.
Yeah, we're next.
Exactly.
Or you've seen a phantasm or a ghost.
Yeah, and again, just reinforcing the eyewitness nature of it, that even when, because some people will speculate the disciples stole the body and all these other things. This doesn't bear the marks of myth making, right? If you're a leader in the church, this isn't sort of the original document you want, sort of helping to show, hey, this is why I should be leader. In fact, it shows like, wow, you guys really weren't ready to follow or to believe. It bears the marks of what actually happened. They were afraid, they were scared, they didn't expect Jesus to rise from the dead. It took Jesus appearing to them and essentially strengthening them, commissioning them, giving them the Holy Spirit to launch the church.
And so when Thomas is told that they've seen the risen Jesus, he says in 2025 that unless I see in his hands the mark of the nails and place my finger into the mark of the nails and place my hand into his side, I will never believe. Very sort of certain about that. And one thing that's good is you can see, first of all, these people weren't going around, people just raised from the dead. Yeah. And he had a Jewish conception of resurrection there. He wanted to make sure there was physical, bodily continuity. Yeah. A renewal in a sense of the same physical form. And to him, this would sort of be the test case to make sure this guy is real. Mm-hmm. I can tactilely feel it, empirically see it, and this matches with the theology I know that's true.
Yeah, they weren't. This defies the idea of a hallucination. Like the disciples said, no, we need to see physically Jesus and interact with him. Thomas saying, I need to see him and physically interact with him and believe he's actually risen from the dead.
Yeah, because that's the kind of resurrection they believed in. We'll talk more about that and the meaning of John 20:28 when we come back on Backpack Radio. My Lord and my God. I think this is really where Thomas, for the first time, totally, I don't even want to say totally, but begins to really realize in that the fullness of who Jesus Christ is. And you see that in John 20:28. But, the resurrection, before we get to John 20:28, actually explains some important things about the beginning of Christianity, the rise of the early church, that otherwise were sort of inexplicable. For example, you have God-fearing, believing Jews that we know were the beginning of Christianity, a movement that we know historically spread out from the epicenter of Jerusalem, who were faithfully attending Sabbath service and worship. It was an important day. And I believe they were still doing that. But here twice, John talks about in this chapter 20, that they were meeting on the first day of the week. And then it says 8 days later, which is the way they would count, because they would count that day as well in the inclusion. So instead of saying 7 days later, they would say 8 days later. They're meeting on what we now call Sunday, both times. That's when they're meeting. That's when Jesus is appearing to them. So it helps to this resurrection day when the Lord is risen. It's called the Lord's Day in Revelation by John himself as well. You see that there explains this transition. Why did that ever happen? That's because that's the third day. That's when Jesus rose from the dead. It also explains how you have God-fearing Jews who are fiercely monotheistic, constantly affirming the Shema, that there's one God, are now willing in some way they never would have been willing to before associate a man walking on the earth with Yahweh himself, as if they're saying, I don't know how, but you are Yahweh embodied. We see that as the doctrine of the incarnation. But this is a big deal because they weren't Greeks who believed in lots of divine men perhaps running around and had a different conception of sort of what deity was in the first place. This is in a Jewish monotheistic system, and these are God-fearing Jews. And yet Thomas says, my Lord and my God.
Well, Jesus was crucified because of his claim to be God. That the high priest, obviously, they're also threatened by a number of different ways. Didn't like all the.
But that's really what they nailed him on.
That's exactly right.
Bad pun. Sorry. Okay, go ahead. Sacrilege.
Yes, but.
Well, so you hear this. Here.
Yes.
There you go. Okay.
Yeah. Well, moving on. Anyway, so that's in the Jewish conception. I mean, these are, as you said, God-fearing Jews. I think we got to understand the full import of that. These aren't sort of religious people in the same way we might think of sort of religious people today who are
right.
Basically, the Jewish people, the religious people of that day would have laughed at sort of what we consider, some people who consider themselves to be religious or in whatever way today. I mean, which is essentially just very superficial. I go and do this. No,
these dudes are serious about Judaism.
Exactly, they're serious about Judaism. They're serious about the faith of their fathers, and so Jesus being crucified by the Pharisees was sort of a way for them to say, "Look, we're faithful Jews, right?" The Pharisees in doing so. The only thing that could rattle that kind of commitment is the resurrection of Jesus.
Yeah, and also, Ramon, remember, Jews of this era did have a concept of resurrection, but it was at the end of the age that they had this idea. You see hints of it in Daniel 12:2, for example, and some other spots, and we know about first century Judaism. They had a concept of resurrection, but it was a general resurrection, everybody at the same time. They had no concept of sort of this out-of-place first fruits resurrection, and definitely not the Messiah, because the Messiah wasn't going to die, and you can see that even in the Gospels themselves, they couldn't put that concept together. Luke, Disciples' Road to Emmaus, talk about it. You see other places, Peter saying that, and yet now they have this idea of a dying on a cross, which is a curse. He's supposed to conquer the Romans, not get conquered by them, and then rising out of time, out of step with everyone, then not establishing the kingdom just yet, ascending, saying, I'm going to come back and do it later, radically altering their theology, but that's because Jesus Christ is risen indeed. We come back in the next segment. We'll talk a little bit more about what it means, my Lord, my God.
Kyrios kai theos.
Yeah, then the way John actually records Thomas saying it, and this is fun because I know.
Let's see how you do.
I know baby Greek now. And so I can see it, what it actually says. Ha Kyrios mu kai ha theos mu. And it literally means the Lord of me and the God of me is what he says there, because I don't know all about the cases, but I believe that's the genitive showing possession. And he's saying, you are my God and my Lord. Yep. Now, Thomas is saying this to Jesus, because watch verse 28, everybody. It says that Thomas answered him, because Jesus says, as he appears to Thomas, hey, put your finger here, stop disbelieving, basically. Thomas answered him, my Lord and my God, Jesus said to him. So then Jesus responds back. So this is directed to Jesus. Mm-hmm. And this is important because, for example, if you're talking to a Jehovah's Witness who would deny the deity of Jesus, they denigrate him to a mere created angel, actually Michael incarnated, who sort of loses his flesh after he resurrects and sort of vanishes into heaven, and now he's Michael again. Mm-hmm. You show them this, and they'll say, well, yeah, Thomas was like exclaiming, like in shock, like, my Lord and my God. So just stop for a second. That means that Thomas, a faithful Jew, is breaking the command not to take God's name in vain in front of Jesus, and Jesus doesn't chide him, instead says, blessed, you've believed, that's great, fantastic. I mean, in fact, it's great when people do what you just did later on, blessed are those who have not seen and yet believe, he says in verse 29. So this is not some exclamation to like taking God's name in vain. And besides, he says to Jesus.
Yeah, I mean, think about the implication of that when Jesus says, I'm blessed that you believed, and even blessed, or even more so, those who won't see, who don't get the chance to physically see Jesus and believe. Believe what?
Yeah,
I mean believe the fact that you just took the Lord's name in vain.
Yeah,
no, I mean that's flowing exactly from Thomas. This is what you believe about me, and I'm affirming. So you've believed because you see me. Well, blessed are those who are going to come after you, who are going to believe off the testimony of what you just said.
Right, because he could have just said something like this, which would make sense. Oh my gosh, you're alive.
Yeah,
you really are the Messiah. It's true. He could have said all kinds of other things, but perhaps Thomas was thinking this week, what would it mean if Jesus was really risen, for example? And who knows exactly how the Spirit moved on his heart and his mind, but he says to Jesus, my Lord and my God, which is really one of the highest clear affirmations of faith in the Gospels. Very simple, but yet very direct. And if it just had my Lord, you could say, well, that's like master or sort of honorific. But then the my God, sort of put those together. That's like, hear, O Lord, hear, O Israel, the Lord your God is one, to Jesus. That's the Shema to Jesus in a way.
Yeah, you're right. I mean, and the Shema that's the hype. There's the articulation of Judaism in the sense of, hear, O Lord, the Lord our God, the Lord is one, right? Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. The Lord our God. I might say that the full title when we say that the God of the Old Testament, the Yahweh, right? Yeah. This is him, right here now. He's before us. This is who Jesus is, and you're right. So I mean, here's an articulation of the Trinity, certainly, isn't it? In the sense that the belief of God, but the belief that this Jesus is God Himself. He's God, the Son of God. Who knows how much they had understood and put it all together,
right?
But very much so. The evidence, like anything else, I mean, it's sort of the evidence is standing right in front of them, and this is a clear affirmation of that.
Yeah, I mean, so this can't be understated, and you can't let people get away with trying to say something other than what it is. And in fact, later on, I would say that John sort of affirms that that's what's supposed to have been said in verses 30 and 31. But also, think about the beginning of John's gospel, because there's an epilogue after verse 31. But as we think about the prologue of John's gospel, John 1:1, John 1:14, we have these affirmations of monogenos, theos, the only God or the only Son is directed towards the Word, who John tells us dwelt among us, who is Jesus, actually mentioned in the text there in John 1. John 1 is a rich chapter, and this is bringing it all together, an envelope around the gospel. And you see Thomas saying this in real time, and Jesus says that people later on are going to believe on the strength of your testimony, basically. I mean, I'm reading into that, but Jesus is realizing, is affirming that, and so does John, because John says in verse 30, now Jesus did many other signs in the presence of the disciples. Again, that means they saw them, which are not written in this book. So he's telling you, I haven't included everything. I didn't write everything about Jesus' life. In fact, there's only 7, depending on how you count them, 8 if you got the resurrection, signs really in John's gospel. But these are written so that you may believe. So these do have a purpose and a point. They're true, but the reason why I've recorded these so that you may believe that Jesus is the Christ. And the hint to me is like you believe the same thing about Jesus that I'm saying here, and also that Thomas just said. Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God, and that by believing you may have life in his name.
Well, the last verse of John, mentions how, look, there's other things Jesus did. If I wrote all of them down, like, it's going to contain all the books that would need to be written. So the reality is that John's purpose wasn't to give an exhaustive account of the life of Jesus. I mean, he said it'd be impossible. His purpose was to show, look, enough things happened in the life of Jesus to demonstrate and to prove that this Jesus was Lord and God. And I'm relaying them to you so that you might understand them and you might believe them.
Yeah, so I mean, this can't be sort of underestimated how important and how impactful this is. These are written so that you may believe. So here's the things to believe about Jesus. One, that he's the Christ. Mm-hmm. So that is the Messiah.
Yeah.
So that he is the one prophesied. And you know what? Remember Psalm 22? Remember Psalm 22? Can I read something from Psalm 22 real quickly? Because you guys remember at the cross when Jesus is in agony. Do you remember what he says in Aramaic? My God, why have you forsaken me? Mm-hmm. Well, that's the first line of Psalm 22, a messianic psalm by David. When you get down to that, it does talk about the trouble and all that this person is experiencing, David, but ultimately transcending to the Messiah. And then you go to verse 16 and watch what it says in Psalm 22. So what I'm saying is Jesus applied the psalm to himself, first of all. And I would say that you can even see further sort of messianic fulfillment here. Verse 16 says, "For dogs encompass me, a company of evildoers encircles me. They have pierced my hands and feet. I can count all my bones. They stare and gloat over me. They divide my garments among them, and for my clothing they cast lots." Now, this is written before crucifixion was a form of torture, at least from what we know. It seems as if the Persians sort of invented it, the Romans sort of perfected it, and the Jews had to experience it. But this wasn't the way, you really killed people back then during David's day, 900 years or so before Christ. And it says, "They have pierced my hands and feet." And, I mean, then you have the prophecy as well about the garments and all of this, bones not being broken. And so Jesus fulfills that. He's the Messiah. And maybe Thomas is even thinking about that, realizing that, until I touch... Oh, he said that on the cross, applying that to himself. I know the rest of the psalm. I mean, there's who knows what's going on there. But if you read Psalm 22, guys, it sounds like it's Jesus talking about himself on the cross in a poetic way, but yet it's in the Old Testament. Jesus is the Messiah, is the Christ who will suffer, just like you see in Isaiah 53, and front and back of that, those songs of the suffering servant there. That is who Jesus is. He is the Messiah.
Yeah, I mean, it seems as if they're tying a couple of things together, and I think this gets fleshed out even more as we move into the church age, because they still had this understanding that we read in Acts 1 how they ask, so is this the time where you're going to come in your you're going to come and establish the kingdom, and they had those those type of questions.
Common messianic expectations.
Exactly, and so it seems as if the Jews almost they thought of the Messiah as a person who's going to come and establish the kingdom. They had this understanding of someone who's going to come and suffer. They didn't tie those things together. I've read some people thought maybe it was going to be two different Messiahs, or maybe Israel had already gone through that. I mean, Jesus coming sort of brings it all together and realize, the Messiah is the one. Yes, he's going to establish a kingdom, but first he must suffer and die for us. And it's as if Jesus dying and then rising from the dead begins to open up their eyes to the full meaning of what was going on. I mean, Jesus, essentially his death and resurrection helps them put their Bibles together in the way that they were supposed to.
Yeah, and this next thing that John says about Jesus here, where it says, "These are written so that you may believe that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God." We don't have time to totally unfold that, but let me encourage you guys. I mean, this is weird for a radio show to have done a show like this, first of all. But we did a whole show on the sonship of Christ and the meaning of the title, the Son of God. I mean, that was the whole show where we discussed that. That's in December of 2011. So I encourage you guys to check that out. You'll be able to get more background about what it means that Jesus is called the Son of God, because it is true. non-sort of deity figures in certain contexts in Hebraic thought could be called Son of God. But when you couple it all together in the context in which Jesus is referred to and in the way it's referred to, you don't have just sort of a mere divine or intercessor or angelic figure or something like that. You see something different about Jesus. And John even uses the word monogenes, which means only or unique or one of a kind, in reference to Jesus' sonship. And so he's the unique, different kind of Son of God here.
You know, I always like to say there's a couple of passages you should always have in your back pocket, sort of just aware of, because they bring so many things together and help you just help you see certain things that should be tied together. You might say it's a one-stop shop, right? For that brings things together for you. And I think this section of Scripture is one of them. I mean, if you think about it, verse 28, my Lord and my God. Verse 31 of John 20, the Christ, the Son of God. All these are said in reference to Jesus, and so it helps us bring all these different concepts together. The uniqueness of Jesus as fully 100% God, but he's one of the persons of the Trinity as the Son of God, the fact that the fulfillment of prophecy of him, the Messiah, the Christ. All these things are sort of put together all in one place.
And we also did do a show as well about the messianic prophecies that Jesus did fulfill with Jeff Durbin, 4/03/2011, called Was Jesus Legit?
Yep. That was a fun show.
Yeah, we break those down even further. And since we're in John, we also did a show last 2 years ago in December, Is John's Gospel Reliable? About the historical reliability of John's account in the first place. And so there's other references that we have done in relation to this, and maybe you would even include the one called The Message of the Cross that we did. So, just to show you there's more here, I encourage you to check those out on the Backpack Radio archives. But look at one other thing, the fact that Jesus is said, if you believe in his name, that means everything about him, that he'll give you life in his name. And see, that's a big deal as well. So we don't have time to much talk about that. Hey, Jeremy, let me do something different. Can you cut that music? I'm going to do something different real quick here. Let me see if I have time to do this. JG, can you say something on the mic real quick? JG just snuck in the studio. I know you can't hear, but can his mic on? Can you just say something even if you can't hear?
What's happening?
Okay, you have a song you did with Shy Lynn, which we've talked about on another show called Active Obedience.
Yes, sir.
That you did. You did the hook, and it would apply. I'm going to try to end the show with that, even though there's only 30 seconds left, and we'll talk to you on another show, JG.
Okay.
So this is Active Obedience, JG, and Shy Lynn.
This one is salvation's massive ingredients, the Lord Jesus Christ and his active obedience.
Yeah.
Backpack Radio.
Ephesians 3:8. These are the unsearchable riches of Christ.
Yeah.
We know today's generation can't stand lectures. We trying to get your attention like hand gestures. The truth is close like London is to Manchester. To understand better, consider...